Every parent knows that moment when their child pushes too far, when discipline must meet defiance. In 1876 Arizona Territory, the Apache elders faced this challenge with 8-year-old Tomas, who had spoken against sacred wisdom with the bold recklessness of youth. They decided to teach him respect through fear, not pain. At sunrise, they led him past the weathered settlement to a dusty clearing and left him alone with nothing. No food, no water, no tools. What they didn't tell him was that a wild mountain lion hunted in these lands. When the great cat appeared, golden muscles rippling in the morning light, any child would scream and run. But Tomas stood perfectly still and stared into those amber eyes. Something passed between them in that silence, something ancient and unexplainable. What happened next changed both their lives forever, but how could such a bond even exist? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sacred council feather lay heavy in Elder Nahal's weathered hands as the morning sun painted the Arizona Territory settlement in shades of gold and shadow. It was an eagle feather, blessed by generations of Apache spiritual leaders. Its pristine white marked only by the dark bands that spoke of the eagle's journey between earth and sky. Today, that feather bore witness to something unprecedented, a child's direct challenge to the wisdom of the ancestors. 8-year-old Tomas Martinez stood in the center of the ceremonial circle, his dark eyes blazing with defiance that had shocked the assembled elders into silence. The boy's small frame trembled, not with fear, but with barely contained anger. His fists clenched at his sides as he faced men who had guided the tribe through decades of hardship and change. In his grandfather's weathered medicine pouch, hanging, forgotten at Vicente's belt, healing herbs rustled softly in the morning breeze, a reminder of the spiritual legacy Tomas seemed determined to reject. "The old ways failed my father," Tomas had declared, his young voice cutting through the sacred quiet like a blade. "Your prayers didn't stop the cavalry bullets. Your ceremonies didn't bring him home." The settlement of Canyon del Oro nestled in the valley where red rock walls rose like ancient guardians, their surfaces carved with petroglyphs that told stories older than memory. Here, 300 Apache souls maintained the delicate balance between honoring their ancestors and surviving. In a world that grew more dangerous each passing season, adobe houses mixed with traditional wickiups, while vegetable gardens flourished alongside native plants that had sustained the people for countless generations. Vicente Martinez, Tomas's grandfather, felt each of his 73 years as he watched his grandson's rebellion unfold. The medicine pouch at his belt had been his father's before him, and his father's before that, a sacred repository of dried sage, blessed cornmeal, and smooth river stones that held the prayers of generations. Inside rested a fragment of turquoise, blue as the endless sky, that was said to connect the bearer with the spirit world. But for all its power, the pouch had not saved Vicente's son from cavalry bullets, just as Tomas had so brutally observed. The boy's mother, Maria, sat among the women with tears streaming down her face. At 28, she carried herself with the dignity expected of a widow, her long black hair braided with the traditional red ribbon that honored her husband's memory. She worked as a seamstress, her nimble fingers creating beautiful beadwork that white traders valued highly. Yet she struggled to reach the heart of a son whose grief had hardened into rage against everything their people held sacred. Elder Joaquin shifted uncomfortably on his woven mat, his stern features showing disapproval at the child's unprecedented disrespect. At 65, he had survived cavalry raids, reservation policies, and the endless pressure to abandon Apache ways in favor of white customs. His authority had never been questioned by a child, and the breach of protocol struck him as dangerous to the very fabric of tribal governance. But Elder Nahaile, wisest of the council and keeper of the sacred stories, studied young Tomas with eyes that had seen 80 winters. He recognized something in the boy's defiance, not mere rebellion, but a spiritual crisis that could either destroy him or transform him into something extraordinary. The eagle feather in his hands seemed to pulse with its own life, as if the spirit of the great bird was present and watching. The confrontation had begun during the morning council when the elders gathered to discuss the increasing pressure from territorial authorities to send Apache children to distant boarding schools. Families were being torn apart by government policies designed to kill the Indian and save the man, and the community struggled with how to protect their culture while ensuring their children's survival. Tomas had been playing near the council circle with his friend Ayana, a gentle girl of 9 whose patience with his moods was legendary among the settlement. She possessed an intuitive understanding of plants and healing that reminded the elders of ancient medicine women, and her presence often calmed Tomas's volcanic temperament. But today, even Ayana's steadying influence could not contain the storm building within him. When Elder Joaquin spoke of the children's duty to honor their ancestors, even in the face of government pressure, Tomas had exploded. The boy's father, Carlos Martinez, had died 6 months earlier in a skirmish with cavalry troops who had accused him of harboring raiders. Carlos had been a peaceful man, a skilled hunter who provided for several families, yet he died because someone claimed he was dangerous. The injustice of it had eaten at Tomas like acid, turning his natural curiosity into bitter cynicism. "Respect must be earned," Tomas had continued, his voice growing stronger as the adult's shocked silence stretched. "If the spirits are so powerful, why do our people suffer? Why do the white soldiers take our land while we sit in circles talking to the wind?" The settlement's daily life reflected the complex reality of Tomas's questions. Each morning, children attended lessons with Mrs. Elena Vasquez, a Mexican woman married to an Apache warrior, who taught them English and mathematics alongside traditional knowledge. They learned to write their names in the white man's alphabet while memorizing the sacred songs that had guided their people across countless migrations. In the central plaza, artisans crafted beautiful pottery and jewelry that found eager buyers. In the growing mining towns, yet these same buyers often treated Apache people as curiosities or threats rather than neighbors. The settlement's blacksmith, a man called Iron Wolf, repaired farming tools and household items while also secretly maintaining the weapons that might someday be needed for protection. Women like Maria balanced traditional roles with new economic realities, their beadwork and weaving providing crucial income while they struggled to preserve cultural knowledge that government agents actively sought to suppress. Children grew up speaking Apache at home and English in public, navigating between worlds that seemed increasingly incompatible. Vicente remembered when such divisions did not exist, when Apache bands moved freely across vast territories that knew no borders except those created by natural features and spiritual boundaries. He had been young when the first mining prospectors arrived, then barely middle-aged when the cavalry established permanent posts throughout the region. Now, in what he increasingly suspected might be his final years, he watched his grandson wrestle with questions that had no easy answers. The medicine pouch at Vicente's belt contained not just healing herbs, but family memories. A small braid of his late wife's hair rested there, along with a piece of flint his own grandfather had napped into a perfect arrowhead. These objects connected him to a chain of ancestors, stretching back to the emergent stories when Apache people first walked into this world through a sacred cave. But Tomas had inherited his father's skepticism along with his mother's fierce intelligence, creating a combination that questioned everything and accepted little on faith alone. The boy read voraciously, consuming every book that passed through the settlement and pestering visiting traders for newspapers from distant cities. His quick mind grasped complex ideas easily, yet he seemed incapable of finding peace with the mystery and uncertainty that formed the foundation of spiritual life. Ayana watched her friend with growing concern as his anger escalated. She had lost her own father to a mining accident 3 years earlier, yet she had found comfort in the traditional teachings about the continuity of life and the presence of departed loved ones in the natural world. Her ability to sense the medicinal properties of plants seemed to grow stronger each year, and the women of the settlement increasingly sought her advice despite her youth. The girl carried a small pouch of her own, filled with dried flowers and leaves that seemed to respond to her touch with unusual vitality. Sometimes, when Tomas's rage threatened to overwhelm him, she would place a sprig of desert sage in his hand and watch as its calming properties somehow penetrated his armor of fury. But today, even her gentle interventions seemed powerless against the storm raging in his heart. Elder Nahale had spent the morning in prayer before the council meeting, seeking guidance from the spirits about the challenges facing their community. The eagle feather he now held had come to him in a vision 20 years earlier, during a fast on the sacred mountain that rose to the east of their settlement. In that vision, he had seen great changes coming, some bringing loss, others bringing unexpected gifts. The feather had guided him through many difficult decisions, its presence reminding him that perspective often required rising above immediate circumstances to see larger patterns. Today, as he studied Tomas's rebellious stance, the feather seemed to whisper of possibilities that lay beyond conventional understanding. The morning council had been called to address several pressing issues beyond the boarding school question. Government officials were pressuring the settlement to move again, claiming that their presence interfered with mining operations in the surrounding hills. Young men from other Apache bands had been conducting raids against supply wagons, bringing unwanted military attention to all Apache communities. And reports had reached them of a large mountain lion that had been seen near the settlement's boundaries, an unusual occurrence that some interpreted as a spiritual sign. As the elders absorbed the shock of Tomas's outburst, the boy himself seemed surprised by the words that had poured from his lips. Part of him wanted to apologize, to restore the harmony that his people valued above almost everything else. But a larger part recognized that he had finally spoken truths that had been burning in his chest for months. The sacred council feather caught the morning light as Elder Nahale slowly stood, his ancient joints protesting the movement. The other elders waited in respectful silence, knowing that whatever came next would require wisdom beyond normal human understanding. The feather had witnessed countless ceremonies and decisions, but never had it presided over such a direct challenge to the very foundations of Apache spiritual life. In that moment of suspension, with the morning sun climbing higher and the settlement's daily routines continuing around them, the course of young Tomas's life balanced on the edge of a blade. The medicine pouch at his grandfather's belt seemed to grow heavier, as if the spirits of the ancestors were gathering to witness what would unfold. And somewhere in the hills beyond the settlement, a golden shadow moved through the brush with the silent grace of a predator whose territory had been invaded by forces beyond her understanding. The old oak tree bore scars from many seasons: lightning strikes, wind damage, and the deep claw marks that revealed the presence of something wild and powerful in these forgotten lands. 4 parallel grooves, each as long as a man's finger, carved through the bark in a pattern that spoke of territorial marking by a creature that feared nothing in these desert hills. Elder Nahale studied the claw marks as the first pale light of dawn touched the abandoned clearing, where weathered cabins leaned at impossible angles, their walls bleached silver by countless seasons of sun and storm. This place had once been a mining camp, back when prospectors believed they could tear wealth from the sacred hills. Now it served a different purpose, a testing ground where Apache youth faced their deepest fears and emerged either broken or transformed. "This clearing has seen many spirits come and go," Nahal said quietly to his fellow elders as they prepared to leave young Tomas alone in this place of power. Some were human, others were not. All left their mark. Elder Joaquin, shifted uncomfortably, his weathered hands gripping the ceremonial staff that marked his authority. The punishment they were about to administer violated every instinct that told him to protect Apache children from danger. Yet the boy's defiance had shaken the very foundations of tribal governance, and extraordinary situations demanded extraordinary responses. The child spoke against the ancestors, Joaquin muttered, his voice carrying the weight of generations who had died to preserve the sacred ways. He must learn that some truths are larger than his young understanding. Tomas stood in the center of the clearing, his small frame dwarfed by the circle of abandoned structures that surrounded him like broken teeth. The elders had awakened him before dawn and led him on the long walk from the settlement without explanation, their silence more unnerving than any threat could have been. His bare feet had grown cold against the sandy earth, and his stomach, cramped with hunger that would only grow worse as the day progressed. The boy's defiance from the previous morning had cost him a night's sleep as he lay on his sleeping mat, replaying his angry words and wondering what consequences would follow. His mother had cried herself to sleep, and his grandfather had sat vigil outside their home, smoking his pipe and speaking prayers to spirits Tomas no longer believed were listening. Now, as the eastern sky brightened with the promise of what would be a brutally hot day, Tomas faced the reality that his rebellion had brought him to this desolate place where even the wind seemed to whisper warnings. The claw marks on the oak tree drew his attention with magnetic force, their deep grooves suggesting a creature of enormous power had claimed this territory as its own. "You will remain here until sunset," Elder Nahale announced, his voice carrying both authority and underlying sadness. "You will have no food, no water, no tools, only the clothes you wear and the thoughts in your head." The old man reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a handful of blessed cornmeal, scattering it in the 4 directions while speaking words in the old language that Tomas understood but pretended not to hear. The ceremony was meant to provide spiritual protection, though whether for the boy or for the elders themselves remained unclear. "When the sun sets, we will return," Joaquin added, his stern features showing no sign of the internal conflict that raged in his heart. "If you survive the day unchanged, you will face the consequences of your disrespect. If you learn humility, perhaps wisdom will follow." The abandoned cabins around the clearing told their own stories of human ambition meeting desert reality. Rusty mining equipment lay scattered among the structures, and the remains of a stamp mill stood like a monument to the folly of those who believed they could conquer these lands through force and technology. Nature had begun its slow reclamation, with desert plants pushing through floorboards and snake holes appearing in walls that had once sheltered dreams of easy wealth. Tomas had heard stories of this place from other children, whispered tales of strange sounds and mysterious lights that appeared after dark. Some claimed the spirits of dead miners haunted the cabins, while others spoke of Apache warriors who had died defending their homeland from invasion. But the boy's rational mind dismissed such stories as superstition, products of imagination, and cultural conditioning rather than supernatural reality. The claw marks on the oak tree, however, were undeniably real and relatively fresh. Something large and powerful had marked this territory within recent months, leaving evidence of its presence that even Tomas's skepticism could not dismiss. As the elders completed their ceremony and began the long walk back to the settlement, the boy found himself studying those grooves with growing unease. "The spirits of this place will teach you what words cannot," Elder Nahal called over his shoulder as the 3 men disappeared into the desert scrub. "Listen with more than your ears, see with more than your eyes." Alone now in the growing heat of early morning, Tomas felt the weight of isolation settle around him like a heavy blanket. The clearing measured perhaps 50 yards across, bordered by the oak tree, the abandoned structures and outcroppings of red rock that reflected the strengthening sunlight with painful intensity. The nearest water source lay miles away, and the settlement might as well have been on the other side of the world. The boy's initial response was anger, the familiar emotion that had sustained him through 6 months of grief and confusion since his father's death. How dare the elders abandon him in this place without provisions or protection? How dare they risk his life to prove some point about respect and tradition? His father would never have agreed to such harsh treatment of a child, no matter what offense had been committed. But as the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher, anger began to give way to more complex emotions. Fear crept in around the edges of his consciousness, fed by the absolute silence that surrounded the clearing. No birds sang in the sparse trees, no insects buzzed in the heat, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for something to happen. The claw marks on the oak tree drew Thomas's attention repeatedly as he explored the boundaries of his temporary prison. The grooves were too large and too deep to have been made by any ordinary animal. They spoke of a predator with claws like daggers and the strength to mark its territory on hardwood as easily as a human might carve initials in clay. Mountain lions were not uncommon in these hills, but they typically avoided areas where humans had established any kind of presence. This clearing, however, occupied a unique position between the human world and true wilderness, a boundary zone where normal rules might not apply. The abandoned cabins provided shelter for any number of creatures, while the spring that bubbled up near the oak tree would attract animals from miles around. As noon approached and his thirst became impossible to ignore, Tomas made his way toward the sound of running water. The spring emerged from a crack in the red rock wall, forming a small pool before disappearing again into underground channels that would eventually feed the stream near his home settlement. The water was clear and cold, tasting of minerals and stone and something indefinable that seemed to carry the essence of the deep earth. Drinking deeply from cupped hands, Tomas felt some of his defiance return. He would survive this test through intelligence and determination, proving that Apache traditions were unnecessary superstition rather than wisdom worth preserving. The elders expected him to break down in fear or desperation, but he would show them that a thinking person could face any challenge without resorting to prayer or ceremony. The mountain lion appeared, as if materializing from the shadow itself, its golden coat blending so perfectly with the sun-drenched rock that Tomas did not see the predator until it was less than 20 feet away. The great cat moved with liquid grace, each step placing enormous paws on the earth with silent precision that spoke of evolutionary perfection in the art of hunting. Amber eyes met the boy's gaze with an intelligence that transcended anything Tomas had expected from a wild animal. This was no ordinary mountain lion, driven by simple hunger or territorial instinct. Something deeper moved behind those eyes, an awareness that seemed to recognize him not as prey, but as an unexpected element in a complex equation that required careful evaluation. The cat's muscles rippled beneath her coat as she settled into a crouch, powerful haunches coiled with the potential for explosive violence. Her black-tipped tail twitched once, twice, then went still as she continued her unwavering study of the small human who had invaded her domain. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, each heartbeat an eternity, as boy and beast took the measure of each other. Tomas felt his knees trembling, but forced himself to remain upright and motionless. Every instinct screamed at him. To run, to shout for help, to do something, anything, to break the terrible tension of this confrontation. But some deeper wisdom, perhaps inherited from countless ancestors who had faced similar moments, told him that movement meant death, and that his only hope lay in the inexplicable connection he felt, growing between himself and this magnificent predator. The mountain lion's amber eyes held secrets older than human memory, and in their depths, Tomas glimpsed something that would change his understanding of the world forever. The small, natural spring bubbled up from deep within the earth, its waters following underground channels that had carved through rock for countless centuries before emerging into sunlight at the base of the red cliff wall. The pool it formed was no larger than a wagon wheel, bordered by smooth stones worn by time and water into perfect curves that reflected the morning light like polished gems. Hours had passed since the mountain lion first appeared, and still neither boy nor beast had moved from their positions of mutual observation. Tomas remained standing near the oak tree, his small frame rigid with tension, while the great cat maintained her crouch beside the largest of the abandoned cabins. The distance between them, perhaps 30 yards, felt simultaneously vast and insignificant, a gulf that could be crossed in seconds if the predator chose to attack. The sun climbed higher, transforming the clearing into a furnace that baked moisture from the air and turned the sandy earth beneath Tomas's bare feet into something that burned like coals. His throat had grown parched, despite the water he had consumed at dawn, and his stomach cramped with hunger that would only worsen as the day progressed. But more pressing than physical discomfort was the psychological strain of maintaining absolute stillness under the unwavering gaze of those amber eyes. The mountain lion seemed equally affected by the heat, her pink tongue appearing briefly as she panted in the shade cast by the cabin's overhanging roof. The sight struck Tomas as strangely reassuring, proof that even apex predators were subject to the same natural forces that governed all living things. She was magnificent but mortal, powerful but vulnerable to the same desert conditions that tested his own endurance. As his thirst became unbearable, Tomas faced a crucial decision. The spring lay directly between his position and the mountain lion's chosen resting place, requiring him to approach dangerously close to the predator if he wanted to drink again. Yet the alternative was slow dehydration under the punishing sun, a fate that would leave him helpless long before the elders returned at sunset. The boy's rational mind calculated distances and angles, seeking a path to the water that would minimize his exposure to attack. But some deeper instinct whispered that such calculations were meaningless when dealing with a creature that could cover ground faster than human thought. If the mountain lion intended to kill him, no amount of strategic planning would make a difference. Drawing on reserves of courage he did not know he possessed, Tomas began moving toward the spring with deliberate, unhurried steps. Each footfall sent small clouds of dust into the still air, and his heart hammered against his ribs with such force that he was certain the sound would trigger the predator's hunting instincts. But the mountain lion remained motionless, those amber eyes tracking his movement with what seemed like curious interest rather than predatory intent. The spring's location created a natural amphitheater where the red rock wall curved inward, forming a sheltered alcove that had probably served as a resting place for countless generations of desert creatures. Ancient petroglyphs decorated the stone surface above the water source, spiral symbols and animal figures that spoke of human presence stretching back to the dawn of Apache memory. Tomas knelt beside the pool and cupped water in his hands, drinking deeply while keeping his eyes fixed on the mountain lion. The liquid was shockingly cold against his parched throat, carrying flavors of stone and earth and something indefinable that seemed to connect him to the deep mysteries of the desert. As he drank, he became aware that he was sharing this life-giving resource with a creature that could end his existence in an instant. The realization should have terrified him, but instead it produced an odd sense of communion. Both he and the predator needed water to survive in this harsh environment. Both were subject to the same natural laws that governed all desert life. In this fundamental requirement, they were equals, despite the vast difference in their capacity for violence. The mountain lion rose from her crouch with fluid grace, muscles rippling beneath golden fur as she padded toward the spring with steps that made no sound on the rocky ground. Tomas felt his breath catch in his throat as she approached, but something in her demeanor suggested caution rather than aggression. She moved like a creature approaching a truce rather than stalking prey. At the pool's edge, The great cat lowered her massive head and began drinking with delicate laps that sent tiny ripples across the water's surface. She was close enough now that Tomas could see the individual whiskers that twitched with each movement, the powerful jaw muscles that could crush bone with casual ease, and the scars that marked her coat with evidence of past battles for survival. Those scars told stories of their own. A long mark across her left shoulder suggested an encounter with claws or fangs, while smaller nicks around her muzzle spoke of confrontations with porcupines or other defended prey. Most telling were the parallel lines across her back, marks that could only have come from human weapons, bullets or blade wounds that had healed into permanent reminders of mankind's capacity for violence. The sight of those scars shifted something fundamental in Tomas's perception of the mountain lion. She was not just a predator, but a survivor, a creature that had faced the same deadly forces that had claimed his father's life. The recognition of shared experience created an unexpected bridge of understanding between boy and beast, a connection that transcended species and spoke to the universal struggle for survival in a dangerous world. His grandfather's voice echoed in memory, sharing stories of the old days when Apache hunters would seek spiritual guidance from the animals they pursued. Every creature has wisdom to offer, Vicente had said during one of their walks in the desert, but you must be still enough to listen, humble enough to learn. At the time, Tomas had dismissed such talk as superstition, the remnants of primitive thinking that had no place in a modern world. But now, sharing water with a mountain lion under the blazing Arizona sun, he began to understand that wisdom might take forms his rational mind had never considered. The great cat finished drinking and settled back on her haunches, amber eyes, studying Tomas with what seemed like renewed interest. Her proximity allowed him to see details that distance had obscured, the way sunlight caught the guard hairs of her coat, creating an almost ethereal glow around her massive frame, the intelligent alertness in her gaze that suggested thoughts and calculations far more complex than simple predatory instinct. For the first time since arriving in the clearing, Tomas felt his rigid posture relax slightly. The mountain lion had demonstrated that she did not view him as immediate prey, at least not while they shared the neutral ground around the spring. This temporary truce might not last beyond the moment, but it offered a respite from the terror that had gripped him since her first appearance. The sun reached its zenith, transforming the clearing into a landscape of harsh shadows and blinding light. Both boy and predator sought what shade they could find, the mountain lion returning to her position beside the cabin while Tomas retreated to the partial shelter offered by the oak tree's spreading branches. The claw marks in the bark took on new significance now, not threatening warnings, but evidence of territorial boundaries that might be respected rather than violated. In the profound silence of the desert noon, separated by yards of sun-baked earth but connected by their shared need for water and shelter, boy and mountain lion began the slow process of learning to coexist in a space where neither was truly at home, yet both belonged. The arrowhead had belonged to Tomas's father, a perfect piece of obsidian knapped with such skill that it seemed to capture light within its black surface and transform it into something both beautiful and deadly. Carlos Martinez had carried it not as a weapon, but as a reminder of the warrior traditions that had shaped Apache identity for countless generations. Now it rested in his son's pocket, a tangible connection to a man whose absence had created a void that anger could not fill. The midday heat forced both boy and mountain lion to seek deeper shade beneath the massive boulder that dominated the clearing's western edge. The stone formation rose 20 feet into the desert sky, its red surface carved by wind and water into flowing curves that suggested frozen movement. Beneath its overhanging ledge, the temperature dropped enough to provide relief from the sun's punishing intensity. Tomas settled against the cool rock wall, grateful for the respite, even as he maintained his vigilant watch on the mountain lion. The great cat had chosen a position on the boulder's opposite side, close enough that he could hear her breathing, but far enough to preserve the delicate balance they had established. Her presence had become almost comforting in its consistency, a known quantity in an environment filled with uncertainty and potential danger. With trembling fingers, the boy withdrew the obsidian arrowhead from his pocket and held it up to catch the filtered light that penetrated their shadowy refuge. The stone surface was smooth as glass, shaped by his father's patient hands into a tool that could penetrate hide and flesh with surgical precision. Carlos had been renowned throughout the settlement for his skill at knapping, creating arrowheads that were works of art as much as instruments of survival. The weight of the arrowhead in his palm brought back memories that Tomas had tried desperately to suppress. His father teaching him to identify different types of stone, explaining how obsidian formed when volcanic glass cooled rapidly, creating edges sharper than any metal blade. The careful process of shaping each piece, striking away tiny flakes with antler tools until the desired form emerged from the raw material. Every arrow carries the hunter's spirit, Carlos had told his son during one of their expeditions into the hills surrounding their settlement. The stone remembers the hands that shaped it, the purpose for which it was made. When you hold this arrowhead, you hold part of me. But the memory brought pain as sharp as the obsidian edge itself. Those same skilled hands had been stilled by cavalry bullets, that gentle voice silenced by men who saw Apache people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings with families and dreams. The arrowhead represented not just his father's skill, but the violent world that had claimed his life, a cycle of bloodshed that seemed to stretch back through generations without hope of resolution. A soft sound from the mountain lion drew Tomas's attention away from his dark reflections. The great cat had risen and was padding slowly around the boulder's base, her movements carrying her into view for the first time since they had sought shelter. She approached with obvious caution, amber eyes fixed on the boy and the object in his hands. The predator's behavior struck Tomas as oddly curious rather than threatening. She moved like a creature investigating something unfamiliar rather than stalking prey, her body language expressing interest without aggression. When she reached a position directly in front of him, perhaps 10 feet away, she settled into a crouch and continued her study with patient intensity. For long moments, they regarded each other across the small space that separated them, the mountain. Lion's gaze seemed to focus on the arrowhead with particular attention, as if she recognized its significance in ways that transcended simple animal awareness. Her scarred coat told its own stories of violence encountered and survived, creating an unexpected parallel between her experience and the grief that had shaped Tomas's young life. The boy found himself speaking without conscious decision, his voice barely above a whisper in the desert stillness. "My father made this," he said, holding up the obsidian point so the mountain lion could see it clearly. "He's dead now, killed by soldiers who were afraid of what they didn't understand." The mountain lion's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but she showed no sign of alarm. Instead, she seemed to settle more comfortably into her position, as if his words had somehow reassured rather than threatened her. The response was so unexpected that Tomas continued speaking, finding relief in voicing thoughts he had shared with no one since his father's death. "I don't know why the elders brought me here," he admitted, his grip tightening on the arrowhead until its sharp edges bit into his palm. "They say I need to learn respect, but how can I respect traditions that couldn't save him? How can I believe in spirits and ceremonies when they failed when we needed them most?" The obsidian seemed to pulse with its own heat as emotions, long suppressed, began pouring out of him. The mountain lion remained motionless, those amber eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that should have been impossible in a wild creature. Her presence created a strange sense of sanctuary, as if the space beneath the boulder had become a confessional where honesty was both safe and necessary. "He was a good man," Tomas whispered, tears beginning to blur his vision. "He never hurt anyone, never took anything that wasn't freely given. He just wanted to live in peace and provide for his family. But they killed him anyway because he was Apache, and that was reason enough." The arrowhead slipped from his fingers as grief overwhelmed him, the obsidian point striking the rocky ground with a sharp click that echoed in the sheltered space. The mountain lion's gaze followed its fall, then returned to the boy's face, with what seemed like recognition of shared pain. Something profound shifted in that moment of vulnerability. The predator that should have terrified him had become a witness to his deepest sorrow, a presence that offered no judgment or false comfort, but simply bore witness to his struggle. The silence between them was no longer tense with potential violence, but heavy with the weight of acknowledged suffering. When the mountain lion rose and approached the fallen arrowhead, Tomas felt no fear. She sniffed the obsidian point delicately, her massive head lowering until her nose nearly touched the stone. For a heartbeat, boy and beast were connected by their shared proximity to this artifact of human craftsmanship and loss. Then, the great cat settled beside the arrowhead, her powerful body creating a protective circle around the fallen object. The gesture struck Tomas as profoundly symbolic, as if she understood that the stone represented something precious that deserved protection rather than destruction. The afternoon shadows grew longer as they maintained their vigil beneath the boulder, the oppressive heat beginning to ease as the sun passed its zenith. The mountain lion's breathing had grown deep and regular, suggesting a level of relaxation that should have been impossible in the presence of a human being. But the normal rules seemed suspended in this place, replaced by something older and more fundamental than the learned behaviors of civilization. Tomas found his own breathing synchronizing with the predator's rhythm, his heartbeat slowing from the frantic pace of terror to something approaching peace. The arrowhead lay between them like a bridge between worlds, connecting the human capacity for creation and destruction with the wild creature's instinctive understanding of both life and death. In the growing shadows beneath the ancient boulder, surrounded by the vast silence of the desert, boy and mountain lion began to discover that survival sometimes required the courage to trust in connections that transcended understanding. The circle of smooth stones lay half hidden beneath decades of accumulated sand and desert debris, but their deliberate arrangement spoke of human intention from a time before memory. Each stone had been carefully selected and placed according to ancient knowledge, creating a medicine wheel that aligned with the cardinal directions and marked this clearing as a place of spiritual significance. Long before white miners had built their temporary shelters, Tomas discovered the stone circle as the afternoon shadows began their slow march across the desert floor, the lowering sun revealing subtle depressions in the earth that had been invisible during the harsh light of midday. The stones themselves were river rocks, worn smooth by countless seasons of water and weather, their surfaces polished to a sheen that reflected the golden light with an almost internal glow. The mountain lion showed immediate recognition of the sacred space, her behavior shifting from casual observation to something approaching reverence as she approached the perimeter of the stone circle. She moved with deliberate care, placing each massive paw with precision that avoided disturbing the ancient arrangement. Her amber eyes swept the formation with an intelligence that suggested familiarity rather than curiosity. The sight of the medicine wheel triggered memories that Tomas had tried to suppress since his father's death. His grandfather Vicente had brought him to similar circles throughout his childhood, teaching him about the sacred geometry that governed Apache spiritual practice. Each stone represented aspects of the natural world: earth, air, fire, and water, while the spaces between them acknowledged the unseen forces that connected all living things. The wheel teaches us about balance, Vicente had explained during one of their pilgrimages to a sacred site in the mountains east of their settlement. East brings new beginnings with the rising sun. South represents growth and the heat of summer. West holds the wisdom of endings and the setting sun. North carries the cleansing power of winter and the ancestors' guidance. At the time, Tomas had listened with the polite attention expected of Apache children, but his heart had remained closed to teachings that seemed irrelevant to the practical challenges of modern life. His father's death had reinforced that skepticism, transforming childhood indifference into active rejection of spiritual concepts that had failed to protect the people he loved most. But now, standing within the ancient circle with a mountain lion as his only companion, those dismissed lessons took on new significance. The stones seemed to pulse with accumulated power from generations of ceremonies conducted within their boundaries. The air itself felt different here, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand upright despite the desert heat. The mountain lion settled at the circle's eastern edge, her massive form perfectly positioned to catch the first rays of tomorrow's sunrise. The placement struck Tomas as too deliberate to be coincidental, suggesting that she understood the sacred significance of each direction within the medicine wheel. Her presence transformed the ancient formation from archaeological curiosity into living spiritual practice. As he stepped carefully over the stone boundary and entered the circle's heart, Tomas felt a shift in consciousness that defied rational explanation. The weight of his grief remained, but it was joined by something else, a sense of connection to forces larger than his personal pain. The stones beneath his feet had witnessed countless ceremonies, absorbed countless prayers, and held the spiritual imprints of ancestors who had faced challenges as overwhelming as his own. The clearing's abandoned cabins and mining equipment took on different meaning when viewed from within the medicine wheel. The miners had built their temporary structures without understanding that they were intruding on sacred ground, creating an unconscious conflict between spiritual significance and material exploitation. Their failure and eventual abandonment seemed less like economic misfortune than inevitable consequence of violating ancient laws they had never bothered to learn. The mountain lion's behavior within the sacred space revealed depths of awareness that challenged everything Tomas thought. He knew about wild animals. She moved between the cardinal directions with purposeful intent, pausing at each station as if acknowledging the spiritual forces represented there. Her actions carried the weight of ritual, suggesting familiarity with ceremonial practices that should have been exclusively human knowledge. When she reached the western stones, the place of endings and wisdom, the great cat settled into a position that allowed her to observe Tomas while maintaining visual contact with the entire circle. Her amber eyes reflected the afternoon light with an intensity that seemed to pierce through surface appearances to examine his soul directly. The scrutiny should have been unnerving, but instead it created a sense of being truly seen for the first time since his father's death. The boy found himself moving through the medicine wheel with growing confidence, his bare feet finding paths between the stones that felt worn by countless previous visitors. At the southern edge, representing growth and the fire of summer, he paused to feel the heat radiating from stones that had absorbed the day's solar energy. The warmth penetrated his skin and seemed to kindle something within his chest that had been cold since the morning he learned of his father's death. Moving to the western position, the place of endings and accumulated wisdom, Tomas encountered the most challenging aspect of the sacred circle. This direction represented not just physical death, but the spiritual transitions that allowed old ways of being to die so that new understanding could be born. His grandfather had tried to explain this concept during their visits to sacred sites, but the boy's young mind had been unable to grasp teachings that seemed focused on mortality and loss. Now, with 6 months of grief weighing on his heart and a mountain lion serving as unlikely spiritual guide, those abstract concepts began to crystallize into emotional reality. His father's death had been an ending, but perhaps not the final one. The boy's anger and rejection of Apache traditions might also need to die if something better was to take their place. The northern position, winter's clarity and ancestral wisdom, challenged him most directly. Here, the medicine wheel acknowledged forces beyond human understanding, spiritual realities that required faith rather than proof. His scientific mind rebelled against accepting anything that could not be measured or tested, yet the evidence of his own experience was becoming impossible to deny. The mountain lion rose from her position and began moving around the circle's perimeter, her path creating a slow, clockwise rotation that mirrored the sun's journey across the sky. Her movement seemed to activate the sacred space, transforming it from static monument into living ceremony. With each circuit, the energy within the circle intensified, until the air itself seemed to shimmer with unseen forces. Tomas felt drawn to join the mountain lion's movement, his feet finding the ancient pathways, as if guided by muscle memory inherited from generations of ancestors. Together, boy and predator created a spiral of motion within the stone circle, their separate species joined in acknowledgement of powers that predated human civilization and would endure long after all current conflicts were resolved. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the medicine wheel became a sanctuary where impossible connections flourished. The mountain lion's presence no longer seemed threatening, but protective, as if she had appointed herself guardian of both the sacred space and the troubled boy who had stumbled into her territory. The ancient stones bore witness to a transformation that neither participants fully understood, but both instinctively recognized as necessary for survival. The approaching sunset would bring the Elder's return and the end of this strange day of testing. But within the medicine wheel, time seemed suspended between past and future, creating a space where healing could begin and new understanding could take root in soil prepared by generations of sacred practice. The lullaby stone nestled warm against Tomas's palm, its surface polished smooth by his mother's loving touch during countless nights when fever or nightmares had driven him from sleep. Maria had inherited the small river rock from her own mother, who had used it to comfort children through the long darkness of difficult nights. Heated by the fire or warmed by body heat, the stone retained temperature longer than seemed possible for such a small object, providing comfort that transcended its humble origins. Tomas had forgotten the stone's presence in his pocket until his searching fingers found it while he sat within the sacred circle, watching the mountain lion's protective circuit around the ancient perimeter. The touch of the familiar object triggered a flood of memories so powerful that tears blurred his vision, and his chest ached with the intensity of sudden longing for his mother's gentle presence. He remembered being 5 years old, burning with the fever that had swept through the settlement that winter, his small body racked with chills that no amount of blankets could ease. Maria had heated the lullaby stone by the fire until it glowed with captured warmth, then wrapped it in soft deerskin before placing it against his chest. The heat had penetrated his ribs and seemed to kindle a healing fire within his heart, while his mother's voice wove protective songs around his restless dreams. "The stone remembers every child it has comforted," Maria had whispered during one of those feverish nights. "It holds the love of mothers and grandmothers who came before us, and someday it will comfort your children too. Love never dies, mijo. It just changes form." The mountain lion paused in her circuit when she noticed the change in Tomas's posture, her amber eyes focusing on the small object in his hands with unmistakable interest. She approached the edge of the medicine circle with cautious steps, her massive head tilting slightly as if trying to understand the significance of something too small to pose any threat, yet clearly important to the boy. For the first time since their encounter began, Tomas felt no fear as the great predator drew near. The lullaby stone's familiar weight in his palm connected him to a chain of maternal love that stretched back through generations, creating a sense of protection that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with the spiritual. Armor woven by women who had dedicated their lives to nurturing others. "My mother gave this to me," he said softly, holding the stone up so the mountain lion could see it clearly. "She used it to help me sleep when I was little, when bad dreams made the darkness too scary to face alone." The mountain lion's response defied everything Tomas thought he knew about wild animals. Instead of ignoring his words or reacting with alarm to his voice, she settled into a lying position at the circle's edge and focused her complete attention on his face. Her posture conveyed not the alertness of a predator, but the patient attention of a creature genuinely interested in communication. The afternoon sun warmed the lullaby stone until it radiated the same comforting heat Tomas remembered from childhood. Illnesses. He pressed it against his chest, feeling the familiar sensation of warmth spreading through his ribs and into the hollow space where his grief had taken residence. The simple gesture connected him across time and space to his mother's love, creating a bridge between his current isolation and the security he had once taken for granted. "She cries at night," he continued, his voice growing stronger as the mountain lion's steady attention encouraged confession. "She thinks I don't hear her, but I do. She cries for my father, and she cries for me because I've become someone she doesn't recognize. The anger inside me scares her, but she doesn't know how to reach me anymore." The truth of those words hit him with unexpected force. His rebellion against Apache traditions hadn't just been directed at the elders or abstract spiritual concepts. It had been a rejection of everything his mother held dear, including the beliefs that had sustained her through the devastating loss of her husband. His anger had become a weapon that wounded the one person who loved him unconditionally. The mountain lion shifted position, moving closer to the stone circle's boundary without crossing the sacred threshold. Her movement brought her within arm's reach of where Tomas sat, close enough that he could see the individual guard hairs that created the golden highlights in her coat. More importantly, he could see something in her eyes that suggested recognition of the pain he was describing. The great cat's scarred coat told its own story of loss and survival, but now Tomas began to understand that her wounds might represent more than simple territorial disputes or hunting accidents. The parallel lines across her back, the marks he had identified as human-inflicted damage, suggested encounters with armed men that had likely cost her more than just physical comfort. "You've lost someone too," he realized aloud, studying the pattern of scars that marked her powerful frame. "Someone you were protecting, maybe your cubs." The mountain lion's response was immediate and unmistakable. Her ears flattened against her skull, and a low sound emerged from her throat. Not a growl of aggression, but a vocalization that carried such profound grief that Tomas felt it resonate in his own chest. The sound spoke of maternal love transformed into protective fury, of a mother's desperate fight against forces too powerful to overcome. Understanding crashed over him like a flash flood in a desert arroyo. This magnificent creature was not just a predator that had claimed the abandoned clearing as hunting territory. She was a mother whose cubs had been killed, a survivor whose protective instincts had been triggered by his presence rather than her hunger. The recognition created an instant bond between them, two beings whose lives had been shattered by violence they could not prevent or understand. The lullaby stone grew warm enough to burn, but Tomas pressed it more firmly against his chest, letting the heat represent all the comfort his mother had tried to provide during the darkest months since his father's death. The mountain lion's presence no longer seemed threatening but kindred. the recognition of shared loss, creating a sanctuary where two grieving souls could acknowledge their pain without judgment or fear. "I've been angry at the wrong people," he whispered, the admission emerging from depths he had not known existed within himself. "The elders didn't kill my father. The traditions didn't fail him. Bad men with guns took him away, just like they took your babies. And I've been punishing everyone who loves me because I couldn't punish the ones who deserve it." The mountain. Lion's response was to rise and approach the very edge of the medicine circle, her massive paws stopping just short of the sacred boundary. She lowered her great head until it was level with Tomas's face, and for a breathless moment they stared into each other's eyes from a distance that could be measured in inches rather than feet. In those amber depths, Tomas saw his own grief reflected and recognized. The lullaby stone pulsed with accumulated warmth as understanding passed between species, creating a connection that transcended the boundaries of human and animal experience. They were not predator and prey, but survivors united by loss. Two creatures whose capacity for love had been tested by violence, yet somehow endured. The setting sun painted the clearing in shades of gold and crimson as boy and mountain lion shared. The profound silence of acknowledged sorrow, the lullaby stone serving as a tangible reminder that love persists even when those who gave it are no longer present to renew its power. The brass button lay half buried in the sand near the largest cabin's collapsed doorway, its tarnished surface catching the late afternoon light with dull metallic gleams that spoke of military origin and violent purpose. The eagle insignia embossed on its face was barely visible beneath layers of corrosion, but the shape was unmistakable, a cavalry officer's button torn from a blue uniform during some long-ago confrontation that had ended badly for all involved. Elder. Nahal spotted the button first, as the three tribal leaders returned to the clearing at sunset, their shadows stretching long across the desert floor as they approached the place where they had left young Tomas to face his deepest fears. The sight that greeted them defied every expectation they had harbored about the day's outcome, challenging their understanding of what was possible between human and animal worlds. The boy sat peacefully within the ancient medicine circle, his small frame dwarfed by the massive mountain lion that rested just outside the sacred perimeter. Neither showed signs of fear or aggression, and the scene carried an air of completion that suggested profound transformation had occurred during their absence. But it was the brass button that drew Nahali's immediate attention, its presence, adding a layer of complexity to an already unprecedented situation. "The spirits have been busy here," Nahale murmured to his companions as they approached with careful steps. "Look how the boy and the lion rest together, as if they have found common ground in shared understanding." Elder Joaquin's hand moved instinctively toward the ceremonial knife at his belt, his stern features showing confusion rather than the satisfaction he had expected to feel upon finding Tomas appropriately chastened by his ordeal. The mountain lion's presence violated every assumption about how this punishment should have unfolded, and her calm demeanor in the presence of humans suggested supernatural forces that challenged his orderly worldview. "This is not natural," Joaquin whispered, his voice carrying undertones of fear that had nothing to do with physical danger. "No wild creature behaves this way around humans. Something else is at work here, something beyond our understanding." Vicente Martinez approached the scene with growing wonder, his grandfather's heart recognizing signs of spiritual intervention that his rational mind struggled to accept. The medicine pouch at his belt seemed to grow warm as he drew near the sacred circle, its contents responding to energies that had been awakened by forces beyond human planning or control. Tomas looked up as the elders arrived, his young face showing none of the defiance that had characterized his behavior during the morning council. Instead, his expression carried a gravity that belonged to someone far older, as if the day's experiences had aged him in ways that could not be measured in hours or seasons. The lullaby stone remained visible in his palm, its smooth surface, reflecting the dying light like a small moon. "Grandfather," Tomas said quietly, his voice carrying new depths of understanding, "I need to tell you something about this place, about her." He gestured toward the mountain lion with movements that showed no fear, only respect for a creature that had shared his darkest moments and emerged as an unexpected ally. The mountain lion's response to the elder's arrival revealed intelligence that transcended normal animal behavior. She rose to her feet with fluid grace, but showed no signs of alarm or aggressive intent. Instead, her amber eyes studied each of the three men with evaluating attention, as if taking their measure and finding them worthy of her provisional trust. Nahale knelt beside the brass button and carefully extracted it from the sand, holding the corroded metal up to catch the last rays of sunlight. The eagle insignia was clear enough to identify cavalry origins, while the button's condition suggested it had been torn from its uniform under violent circumstances. Its presence in this sacred clearing added sinister implications to what had initially seemed like a miraculous encounter. "This tells a story," the elder said grimly, turning the button over in his weathered hands. "A story of soldiers who came here before, who brought violence to a place meant for healing and spiritual practice." The mountain lion's reaction to the brass button was immediate and heartbreaking. Her ears flattened against her skull, and the same grief-filled vocalization that had moved Tomas to tears emerged from her throat. But now, in the presence of the physical evidence, her response carried additional layers of meaning that spoke to specific memories of loss and trauma. Tomas stood within the medicine circle and faced the elders with new authority, born from his day of testing. "They killed her cubs," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of revelation that had transformed his understanding of both the mountain lion and his own grief. "Soldiers came here months ago, probably looking for Apache raiders. They found her den instead." The boy's narrative unfolded with details that could only have come from some form of communication with the mountain lion herself, though the mechanism of that exchange remained mysterious. He described cavalry patrols that had treated the sacred clearing as convenient camping ground, showing no respect for its spiritual significance or awareness of the wildlife that called it home. "She tried to protect them," Tomas continued, his voice growing stronger as he channeled understanding that came from depths beyond his years. "But there were too many soldiers with too many guns. They killed her cubs because they were afraid, because they didn't understand that she was only defending her family." Vicente felt tears gathering in his eyes as his grandson's words painted pictures of tragedy that paralleled their own family's loss. Carlos Martinez had died defending Apache families from cavalry aggression, while this mountain lion had lost her cubs to the same mindless violence that seemed to follow soldiers wherever they went. The parallel was too perfect to be coincidence, too meaningful to dismiss as mere chance. Elder Joaquin struggled with the implications of what they were witnessing. His orderly mind demanded logical explanations for phenomena that defied natural law. Yet the evidence of his own senses could not be denied. The mountain lion's behavior, the boy's transformation, and the brass button's presence created a pattern that suggested spiritual intervention on a scale that challenged everything he thought he knew about the relationship between human and animal worlds. "The spirits brought them together," Nahale said with growing certainty as understanding crystallized in his ancient mind. "Two beings who had lost what they loved most to the same violence, two hearts that needed healing from the same wounds." This was never about punishment. It was about teaching both of them that they were not alone in their grief. The mountain lion approached the edge of the medicine circle as if drawn by the elder's words, her massive form moving with the dignity of a creature that had endured unspeakable loss, yet somehow maintained the capacity for trust. When she reached the sacred boundary, She settled into a position that allowed her to observe all four humans while maintaining her protective stance over the space where she and Tomas had found unexpected communion. The brass buttons seemed to burn in Nahal's palm as the full significance of the day's events became clear. What they had intended as harsh lesson in humility had become sacred initiation, transforming a rebellious child into a bridge between worlds. The mountain lion's presence was not obstacle to overcome, but gift to receive, evidence that the spirit world remained active and engaged with human affairs, despite the growing influence of those who denied its existence. The question now, Vicente said quietly, as he studied his transformed grandson, is what we do with this knowledge. The territorial authorities will not understand what has happened here. They will see only a dangerous wild animal that threatens human safety. Tomas looked directly at his grandfather, his young eyes carrying wisdom that had been purchased with pain but tempered by compassion. "Then we protect her," he said simply, "just as she protected me today. We find a way to honor what happened here without destroying the very thing that made it possible." The mountain lion's amber gaze swept across the assembled humans as if she understood that her fate now rested in their hands. The brass button in Elder Nahal's palm represented the violence that had shaped all their lives, but the medicine circle around Tomas spoke to possibilities that transcended the cycle of aggression and revenge. As the sun touched the western horizon and painted the clearing in shades of fire and gold, 5 beings, 4 human and 1 feline, faced the challenge of protecting a miracle that had emerged from the depths of shared sorrow and somehow discovered the courage to trust in. Connection that defied every rational explanation. Vicente's vision pipe had not seen ceremonial use in over a year, its carved pipestone bowl darkened by sacred tobacco that had carried countless prayers to the spirit world during more than 4 decades of tribal service. The pipe itself was a work of art, its wooden stem decorated with eagle feathers and beadwork that told the story of visions received and wisdom gained through decades of spiritual practice. Tonight, as emergency council convened under a star-filled sky, the pipe would be called upon to provide guidance for a situation that had no precedent in Apache memory. The tribal council gathered in the ceremonial circle at the settlement's heart, their faces illuminated by firelight that danced across features carved by wind and worry. Word of Tomas's transformation had spread through the community with the speed of wildfire, creating a mixture of wonder and fear that divided families and challenged long-held beliefs about the boundaries between human and animal worlds. Elder Nahal sat in the eastern position, the brass cavalry button resting on a piece of deerskin before him, like evidence in a trial where the accused was not present to defend herself. The button's tarnished surface reflected firelight with metallic gleams that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, a reminder of the violence that had shaped both human and animal experience in this contested territory. "The boy speaks truth," Nahal said as he prepared the sacred pipe, with movements that carried the weight of ancient ritual. "I have seen the mountain lion's response to the cavalry button, witnessed her grief when confronted with evidence of her loss. She is no ordinary predator, but a mother whose cubs were murdered by men who saw her family as obstacles to be eliminated." Maria Martinez sat among the women, her face showing the strain of a mother caught between protecting her son and understanding forces beyond her comprehension. The lullaby stone that had comforted Tomas during his ordeal now rested in her palm, its smooth surface still carrying traces of the warmth that had bridged the gap between human and animal suffering. "My son has changed," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the circle with the authority of maternal knowledge. Not just in his words, but in his spirit. The anger that has consumed him since his father's death has been replaced by something deeper, something that speaks to wisdom rather than rebellion. But not all community members shared Maria's acceptance of what had transpired in the sacred clearing. Several families expressed concerns about the safety implications of Tomas's bond with a creature that could kill a human being with casual ease. The territorial Indian agent had been asking questions about unusual animal activity in the area, and any incident involving a mountain lion would bring unwanted government attention to their settlement. Elder Joaquin voiced the practical concerns that kept him awake at night. The boy may have found peace with this creature, but what happens when she encounters other humans who lack his unusual connection? What happens when the territorial authorities learn that we are harboring a dangerous predator instead of reporting its presence for elimination? The vision pipe glowed with sacred fire as Vicente drew the blessed smoke into his lungs and released it toward the four directions. Each breath carried prayers for guidance, while the carved pipestone bowl seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The pipe had been crafted by his grandfather from stone, quarried at the sacred pipestone grounds far to the north, and its power to reveal spiritual truth had never been questioned during Vicente's lifetime. "The spirits speak of balance disturbed and healing needed," Vicente said as visions began forming in the sacred smoke. "They show me two paths, one leading to destruction through fear and misunderstanding, another opening to possibilities that could transform our relationship with the natural world." Young Ayana sat beside her grandmother, her intuitive understanding of healing plants having expanded during the day to include insights about the spiritual forces that connected all living beings. She had visited the sacred clearing after the elders returned with Tomas, and her sensitive nature had allowed her to perceive energies that lingered in the medicine wheel like echoes of profound transformation. "The mountain lion is guardian now," Ayana said, with the quiet authority that often accompanied her healing work. "She protects the sacred space because she understands its power to heal wounds that go deeper than flesh." Tomas was not the only one who found healing there today, but the community's internal debate was complicated by external pressures that threatened to overwhelm any spiritual resolution they might achieve. A messenger had arrived from the territorial capital with word that Indian agent Samuel Morrison would be conducting his quarterly inspection within days. Morrison had built his reputation on aggressive enforcement of federal policies designed to suppress Apache culture and force assimilation into white society. The agent's arrival would bring scrutiny to every aspect of settlement life, from the children's education to the community's compliance with regulations that seemed designed to strangle traditional ways of living. Any evidence of dangerous wildlife in the area would provide Morrison with excuses to recommend relocation or other punitive measures that could destroy the fragile stability the community had achieved. "Morrison sees threats everywhere," muttered. Iron Wolf, the settlement's blacksmith, and one of the few men who had served as cavalry scout before returning to Apache ways. "He views our spiritual practices as evidence of continued hostility toward government authority. If he learns about the boy's connection to a mountain lion, he will use it to justify measures we cannot resist." The sacred pipe passed from hand to hand around the circle, each community member drawing blessed smoke and adding their prayers to the growing chorus of voices seeking guidance from the spirit world. The visions that emerged from the sacred tobacco painted pictures of possible futures that ranged from harmony to catastrophe, depending on choices that had not yet been made. Tomas himself sat quietly beside his grandfather, his young face showing none of the defiance that had characterized his behavior before the day's transformation. The lullaby stone in his mother's hands seemed to connect him across the circle to the love that had sustained him through his darkest hours, while the brass cavalry button before Elder Nahal served as reminder of the violence that threatened all they held dear. "I can call her," Tomas said simply when the pipe reached him. "She will come if I ask, but only if she chooses to trust the people I bring with me. She has learned to be careful around humans who carry the smell of metal and gunpowder." The boy's words carried implications that sent ripples of unease through the assembled council. His connection to the mountain lion was clearly deeper than anyone had initially understood, suggesting forms of communication that transcended normal boundaries between species. The power he described was unprecedented in Apache experience, yet its reality could not be denied by those who had witnessed its effects. Elder Nahali felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. The vision pipe had revealed spiritual truth, but translating that truth into practical action required wisdom that drew on both traditional knowledge and understanding of the dangerous world beyond their settlement's boundaries. "The spirits show me a test approaching," he said, as smoke from the sacred pipe created patterns in the firelight that seemed to move with their own purpose. "Forces will gather that seek to destroy what has been created in the sacred clearing. The boy and the mountain lion will face challenges that require courage from our entire community." Vicente's weathered hands trembled slightly as he drew final breaths from the vision pipe, his consciousness expanding to encompass possibilities that stretched far beyond the immediate crisis. In the sacred smoke, he saw images of the territorial agent arriving with armed men, of confrontations that could end in violence unless wisdom prevailed over fear. "The test comes tomorrow," he announced with the authority of confirmed vision. "Morrison arrives with soldiers who have orders to investigate reports of dangerous wildlife. They will demand access to the sacred clearing, and they will not accept spiritual explanations for what they find there." The assembled community absorbed this news with the grim recognition that their carefully maintained isolation was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. The mountain lion's presence, which had seemed like a gift from the spirit world, now threatened to become the catalyst for destruction that could scatter their families and end their traditional way of life. Tomas looked around the circle at faces that showed fear, wonder, and determination in equal measures. The brass cavalry button seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the firelight, a reminder that violence remained the preferred solution for men who lacked the patience or wisdom to seek understanding. But the lullaby stone in his mother's hand spoke to different possibilities, connections that transcended fear and opened pathways to healing that government agents might never comprehend. "Then we prepare," the boy said with authority that belied his 8 years. "We prepare to show them that some things are more important than regulations, that some connections are too sacred to be destroyed by men who mistake power for wisdom." The vision pipe's sacred fire dimmed as the ceremony reached its conclusion, but the smoke continued to rise toward stars that had witnessed countless generations of Apache struggles for survival and meaning. Tomorrow would bring challenges that would test everything they believed about the relationship between human and natural worlds. But tonight they had the gift of preparation and the guidance of spirits who had never abandoned those who sought wisdom over violence. The brass cavalry button lay silent on its deerskin mat, but the mountain lion moved through the darkness beyond their settlement like a golden shadow, her amber eyes reflecting starlight as she maintained her vigil over the sacred clearing where healing had begun and transformation had taken root. In soil prepared by generations of prayer and ceremony, the silver peace medal hung heavy around Elder Nahal's neck as Indian agent Samuel Morrison rode into the settlement at dawn, his cavalry escort of 6 soldiers creating dust clouds that seemed to announce their arrival as a declaration of war rather than official inspection. The medallion bore the image of clasped hands beneath an American eagle, symbols of friendship and cooperation that had proven meaningless in the face of government policies designed to eliminate Apache culture through force and deception. Morrison himself was a thin man whose pale features had been hardened by years of frontier service, his gray eyes holding the cold calculation of someone who viewed Apache people as problems to be managed rather than human beings deserving of respect. His blue uniform was pressed and spotless despite the long ride from the territorial capital, while the Colt revolver at his hip carried the weight of authority backed by federal power. "I've received reports of dangerous wildlife in this area," Morrison announced without preamble as he dismounted near the settlement's central plaza. "Mountain lions specifically, large cats that pose a threat to human safety and must be eliminated before they can attack innocent settlers." The soldiers spread out behind their commanding officer with practiced efficiency, their carbines held at ready positions that suggested they expected resistance to their mission. Their faces showed the mixture of boredom and contempt that characterized men who had spent too many years enforcing policies they might not fully understand, but were paid to implement without question. Tomas stood beside his grandfather at the edge of the gathering crowd, his young face showing none of the fear that gripped other community members as they faced this invasion of their carefully maintained peace. The lullaby stone rested in his pocket, its familiar weight providing comfort that transcended the physical threat posed by armed men who saw Apache traditions as obstacles to be overcome. "Agent Morrison," Elder Nahal replied with diplomatic courtesy that barely concealed his growing anger. "We have had no problems with dangerous animals in our territory. Our people live in harmony with the natural world, as our ancestors have done for countless generations." The Peace Medal's silver surface caught the morning light as Nahale stepped forward, its presence serving as reminder of treaties signed and promises broken by government officials who spoke of friendship while planning destruction. The medallion had been presented to his grandfather by territorial negotiators who swore that Apache rights would be respected as long as the people remained peaceful and cooperative. Morrison's response revealed the contempt that lay beneath his official demeanor. "Your ancestors' ways have no place in a civilized territory," he said with casual dismissal. "We're here to investigate specific reports of a large mountain lion that has been seen near your settlement. Such predators must be destroyed before they can threaten human life." One of the soldiers, a sergeant whose scarred face spoke of frontier violence, stepped closer to the gathered Apache families with deliberate intimidation. His carbine remained pointed toward the ground, but his finger rested near the trigger guard in a gesture that carried unmistakable threat. The man's eyes swept across the assembled faces with the evaluation of someone assessing potential resistance. "To their mission, we'll need guides to show us the areas where this animal has been sighted," Morrison continued, his tone allowing no possibility of refusal. "Cooperation with federal authorities is not optional in this territory," Vicente felt, the medicine pouch at his belt growing warm as spiritual forces responded to the threat posed by these armed intruders. The sacred objects within seemed to pulse with their own energy, as if the spirits of his ancestors were gathering to witness this confrontation between traditional wisdom and government authority. The vision pipe's revelations from the previous night had prepared him for this moment, but knowing what was coming did not make it easier to face. Tomas looked toward the hills, where he knew the mountain lion maintained her vigil over the sacred clearing, wondering if she could sense the danger that approached her sanctuary. The connection they had forged during yesterday's ordeal remained strong enough that he could almost feel her presence in the distance, her amber eyes watching and waiting for signals that would determine whether trust or violence would govern. "The day's outcome. The areas you seek are sacred to our people," Elder Nahali said carefully, his words chosen to avoid direct confrontation while protecting the spiritual significance of the mountain lion's territory. "They contain ceremonial sites that have been used for religious purposes since time beyond memory." Morrison's laughter carried no humor, only the harsh sound of a man who viewed Apache spiritual practices as primitive superstition that had no legal standing under territorial law. "Your religious claims have no bearing on federal authority," he replied coldly. "Dangerous animals must be eliminated regardless of where they choose to make their dens." The peace medal seemed to grow heavier around Nahali's neck as he recognized that diplomatic solutions would not resolve this crisis. The silver symbol of friendship had become a weight that reminded him of every promise broken by government. Officials who spoke of cooperation while planning conquest. The soldiers' ready weapons and Morrison's dismissive attitude revealed the true nature of federal intentions toward Apache people and their traditional ways of life. In the distance, a sound carried on the morning wind, a vocalization that might have been mistaken for bird call by untrained ears, but which Tomas recognized as the mountain lion's response to approaching danger. She was warning him that armed men were moving toward her territory, trusting in their connection to provide advance notice of threats she could not face alone. The moment of crisis had arrived, and every choice made in the next few hours would determine whether understanding or violence would govern the relationship between worlds that were beginning to collide. The rainbow-colored prayer feather descended from the clear morning sky like a gift from the spirit world itself, its iridescent surface catching sunlight and transforming it into bands of color that seemed to pulse with their own inner fire. The feather's appearance at the moment of greatest tension between Apache people and federal authority defied every natural law that governed ordinary experience, yet its reality could not be denied by any of the witnesses who watched it settle, gently on the ground between opposing forces. Tomas stood in the sacred clearing where yesterday's transformation had occurred, his small frame positioned directly between the mountain lion and the armed soldiers who had followed Agent Morrison through the desert to this place of ancient power. The great cat crouched behind him with muscles coiled for explosive action, her amber eyes fixed on the weapons that threatened everything she had learned to trust during her unlikely bond with the Apache boy. "Step away from that animal immediately," Morrison commanded, his revolver drawn and pointed toward the mountain lion with trembling hands that revealed fear beneath his authoritative facade. "That creature is a clear and present danger to human life. We have orders to eliminate it before it can attack innocent people." The prayer feather's descent had created a moment of supernatural suspension that froze all participants in poses that would have seemed theatrical if not for the genuine terror and wonder that played across their faces. Morrison's soldiers maintained ready positions with their carbines, but their eyes remained fixed on the impossible feather that continued its slow drift toward Earth like a message from realms beyond human understanding. Elder Nahal recognized the feather's significance with the certainty of a man who had spent decades interpreting spiritual signs. Its rainbow coloration marked it as a bridge feather, a sacred object that appeared only when the spirit world sought to create connection between opposing forces that seemed destined for violent conflict. Such feathers were mentioned in the oldest Apache stories, but none had been seen in living memory. "The spirits speak," Nahale announced with authority that silenced even Morrison's protests. "They send a sign that this conflict must be resolved through understanding rather than violence." The feather bridges all worlds, earth and sky, human and animal, traditional wisdom and modern authority. The mountain lion's response to the prayer feather's appearance revealed depths of spiritual awareness that shocked even those who had witnessed her connection with Tomas. She rose from her defensive crouch and approached the falling feather with movements that carried reverence rather than predatory intent, her massive head lowering in what could only be described as a gesture of recognition and respect. Tomas felt the power of the moment flowing through him like electricity, connecting him not just to the mountain lion, but to forces that transcended individual consciousness and touched the fundamental energies that governed all life. The lullaby stone in his pocket grew warm enough to burn, while the medicine wheel beneath his feet seemed to pulse with accumulated power from generations of ceremonies conducted within its boundaries. "She's not dangerous," Tomas said with quiet authority that belied his 8 years. "She's a mother who lost her cubs to violence, just like I lost my father. The spirits brought us together to heal wounds that couldn't be healed alone." Agent Morrison struggled with evidence that challenged every assumption he had brought to this confrontation. His orders were clear: eliminate dangerous wildlife that threatened human settlement in the territory. But the scene before him defied classification according to any regulations or procedures he had been taught to implement. The mountain lion showed no signs of aggression despite being surrounded by armed men, while the Apache boy demonstrated a connection to the wild creature that transcended normal human experience. The prayer feather settled on the ground directly between Morrison and the mountain lion, its rainbow surface creating a pool of color that seemed to absorb and reflect light in ways that violated optical physics. The moment it touched earth, a profound silence descended on the clearing, as if the natural world itself was holding its breath to hear what words would follow this unprecedented spiritual intervention. Vicente stepped forward with his grandson, the peace medal around his neck catching light from the prayer feather and reflecting it back in patterns that created brief flashes of illumination across the assembled faces. 40 years ago, government officials gave my father this medal as a symbol of friendship between our peoples, he said quietly. They promised that Apache rights would be respected as long as we remained peaceful and cooperative. The old man's weathered hands lifted the peace medal from his neck and held it up for all to see, its silver surface tarnished by decades of broken promises and failed diplomacy. Today, you bring guns to a sacred place, threaten to destroy a spiritual connection that has brought healing to broken hearts. Is this the friendship your medal represents? Morrison found himself caught between federal authority that demanded action and growing awareness that he was witnessing something beyond the scope of his official duties. The prayer feather's presence created a zone of influence that seemed to affect even the soldiers behind him, their weapons gradually lowering as supernatural forces overwhelmed their military training. The mountain lion approached the prayer feather with careful steps, her amber eyes reflecting its rainbow colors as she investigated this gift from the spirit world. When she reached the sacred object, she settled beside it in a pose that conveyed protection rather than possession, her massive frame creating a living guardian for the bridge between worlds that the feather represented. Tomas walked slowly toward the prayer feather, his connection to the mountain lion allowing him to approach without triggering defensive responses from the great cat. When he reached the spot where the rainbow colors pulsed with spiritual energy, he knelt and picked up the sacred object with hands that trembled with the magnitude of what was occurring around him. The spirits want peace, he said simply, holding the prayer feather high enough for everyone to see its iridescent beauty. They want understanding instead of violence, healing instead of destruction. This is their message to all of us. The friendship stone circle had grown over the weeks following the prayer feather incident, as children from the settlement began placing small river rocks around the perimeter of the sacred clearing in patterns that mirrored the ancient medicine. Wheel but spoke to their own understanding of the forces that connected all living beings. Each stone represented a lesson learned from Tomas's transformation, creating a permanent reminder that respect for the natural world could bridge gaps that seemed impossible to cross. 3 months had passed since Agent Morrison's confrontation with supernatural forces that challenged everything he thought he knew about Apache culture and federal authority. His official report to territorial headquarters had described the successful pacification of a dangerous mountain lion through innovative diplomatic techniques that avoided the need for violence. The reality of what he had witnessed remained buried in classified files that would never see public scrutiny, while Morrison himself had requested transfer to administrative duties that kept him far from frontier territories where such impossible events might occur again. Tomas sat within the expanded stone circle as autumn painted the desert hills in shades of gold and crimson, his daily visits to the sacred clearing having become a ritual that connected him to the mountain lion and the spiritual forces that had transformed his understanding of grief and healing. The great cat remained in the area, her presence serving as guardian for the sacred space, while maintaining the bond that had saved both their lives during the darkest period of their respective journeys through loss. The boy's relationship with his mother and grandfather had deepened through shared recognition of the miraculous events that had reshaped their family's spiritual foundation. Maria no longer cried herself to sleep, finding comfort in the knowledge that her son had discovered purpose that transcended his anger about his father's death. The lullaby stone had become a family treasure that connected 3 generations through its power to provide comfort during difficult transitions. Vicente carried his medicine pouch with renewed pride, understanding that the sacred objects within had played their part in guiding his grandson toward wisdom that might otherwise have taken decades to achieve. The vision pipe remained ready for ceremonial use, its carved surface holding memories of the night when spiritual guidance had prepared their community for challenges that seemed insurmountable, yet proved to be opportunities for growth rather than destruction. Elder Nahale had become the keeper of the prayer feather, which resided in a special place of honor within the settlement's ceremonial lodge. Its rainbow colors had not faded despite exposure to desert sun and wind, leading many to believe that it carried permanent blessings from the spirit world. Children often asked to see the sacred object, their young minds more accepting of its supernatural origins than the adults who struggled to reconcile miracle with rational understanding. The mountain lion's daily routine had evolved to include protective circuits around the expanded settlement boundaries, her presence serving as deterrent to both human and animal threats that might disturb the peace that had been so carefully constructed. Her scars remained visible reminders of past violence, but they no longer seemed to cause her pain. Instead, they had become symbols of survival and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. Ayana had developed her healing abilities under the guidance of the settlement's medicine woman, her intuitive understanding of plant properties, having expanded to include insights about the spiritual connections that existed between all forms of life. She often accompanied Tomas to the sacred clearing, where her presence helped maintain the delicate balance between human and animal worlds that made their unlikely friendship possible. The Friendship Stone Circle had attracted attention from other Apache communities, with families traveling long distances to see the place where a boy and a mountain lion had discovered common ground in shared grief. These pilgrimages had brought new energy to the settlement, while creating networks of support that strengthened traditional culture in the face of continuing government pressure to abandon Apache ways. Agent Morrison's replacement, a younger man named Thomas Garrett, had proven more receptive to diplomatic solutions that respected Apache spiritual practices while maintaining federal oversight of territorial activities. Garrett's reports to his superiors emphasized the settlement's peaceful nature and cooperative attitude, creating a buffer of official protection that allowed traditional ceremonies to continue without interference. The abandoned mining cabins in the sacred clearing had been gradually reclaimed by desert vegetation, their weathered walls becoming foundations for new growth that transformed symbols of exploitation into elements of natural beauty. The oak tree with its mountain lion claw marks had become a shrine, where visitors left offerings of tobacco and cornmeal, honoring both the spiritual significance of the place and the courage of the boy who had faced his deepest fears within its shadows. Tomas had resumed his education with Mrs. Vasquez, but his studies now included intensive instruction in traditional Apache knowledge that had previously seemed irrelevant to his modern ambitions. He learned the old songs and ceremonies with enthusiasm that surprised adults who remembered his rebellious attitude toward cultural practices, while his academic achievements in mathematics and reading continued to impress visiting territorial inspectors. The brass cavalry button remained in Elder Nahale's possession, serving as reminder that violence remained a constant threat in their world, despite the miraculous healing that had occurred in the sacred clearing. But its power to inspire fear had been transformed into motivation for vigilance, encouraging community members to remain alert for signs of trouble while maintaining faith in the spiritual protection that surrounded their settlement. The prayer. Feather's message of peace and understanding had spread beyond Apache communities to influence relationships with neighboring ranchers and miners who had previously viewed all Native Americans with suspicion and hostility. Several Anglo families had visited the settlement to learn about traditional healing practices, creating bridges between cultures that had seemed destined for permanent conflict. As winter approached and the anniversary of his father's death drew near, Tomas felt none of the despair that had consumed him during the previous year's memorial observances. The mountain lion's continued presence in his life provided daily reminders that loss could be transformed into connection, that grief could become the foundation for wisdom rather than the source of destructive anger. The friendship stone circle would continue growing as future generations added their own contributions to the pattern, creating a living monument to the truth that understanding could triumph over fear when courage was combined with willingness to listen to voices that spoke in languages older than words. The mountain lion appeared at the clearing's edge as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, her golden coat catching the afternoon light with an inner fire that spoke of health and contentment rather than the desperate survival that had characterized her existence before finding sanctuary in this sacred place. She approached Tomas with the easy confidence of a creature that had learned to trust in connections that transcended the boundaries between species. Together, boy and mountain lion settled within the friendship stone circle as evening painted the desert sky in shades of purple and gold. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with understanding that required no words to convey its meaning. They had saved each other through the simple act of recognizing shared pain and choosing to heal rather than remain wounded. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, their ancient light bearing witness to a bond that had transformed tragedy into hope and isolation into communion. In the distance, smoke rose from cooking fires in the settlement, carrying the sense of home and family that welcomed all who had learned the wisdom of belonging to something larger than themselves. The sacred clearing would remain a place of healing for as long as the stones endured and the mountain lion's descendants maintained their guardianship over the medicine wheel. And in the years to come, when other children faced losses that seemed too great to bear, they would find their way to this sanctuary where a boy and a wild cat had discovered that love persists even when those who gave it are no longer present. To renew its power, the friendship stones would multiply with each season, creating an ever-expanding circle that honored the truth revealed in this place, that connection transcends difference, that healing grows stronger when shared, and that the spirit world remains active in the lives of those who possess the courage to recognize its presence in the most unexpected forms.